The Y Curve with Phil Dobby and Roger Hearing.
The votes are in or almost in.
But how many of them actually count?
How often has your vote made a difference?
If you're Labour and you live in a true blue constituency, what's the point in making your mark on the ballot paper?
The first past the post system was designed for when you elected the person to represent your town, not the party.
But how many of us even know who our MP is?
In Europe, it's only us and Belarus who stick to this way of voting.
So is it time to change to a proportional system?
So that we are all represented.
The Y Curve.
Now, of course, many people will be listening to this after the election results are out, but we are recording and publishing, actually. We're publishing on the day of the election when people are going out to vote.
So we don't know.
So we've never had, well, I think, and we can ask our guest on this, I think 1931, when we elected the national government, that was actually the last time when people voted for a government that was a majority government. It's always been less. The party has always got less than 50% of the vote.
Oh, right. Okay.
So straight away, ever since then, the party that's elected is the party that most people didn't want.
Which is interesting, isn't it?
So is that a problem?
Or didn't say they did want. Because, I mean, don't forget, you've got an awful lot of people who don't vote anyway as well. But, yeah, I mean, is this issue of we are in a democracy once every 5 years at least, but most of us, me included up to this point, have never really lived anywhere where the person supposedly representing me was in any sense in line with my views.
Yeah, and of course this idea of the Westminster system where you're voting for somebody who's representing your local area. I mean, that is important, isn't it? And that's why, because you do want somebody who represents your local area, but there again, are they really doing that? I mean, is that what?
Who knows? I mean, how many people, if you stop them in the street, would even know who their MP was? That's the thing.
Yeah.
And so our whole idea of the system, yes, you do need representation for sure. But I mean, maybe something that we'll talk about this, but multi-member constituencies, bigger constituencies, but where at least, you have three people saying there's a fair chance that one of them might actually be your political persuasion.
Exactly. Yeah, broaden the area rather than local towns. Because we've got local councils, and so for being represented on local issues like who's fixing the potholes, you vote on that. You don't need that level to be brought up to Westminster. So maybe the system is just a bit out of date.
You think? The British political system? No.
But how do you change it? That's the problem, because it is it's almost like a constitutional change.
And the big point, which I'm sure we will hear, or certainly we'll talk about, is that it does provide a kind of majority. I mean, maybe an unfair one.
Yeah.
But the argument is we've had strong governments. Well, we kind of haven't if you look over the past few years. But strong government, which, those terrible people on the continent never have.
Exactly.
Well, joining us now is someone who really knows about all this, and that's Dr. Heinz Brandenberg, Senior Lecturer in Politics at the University of Strathclyde, also co-author of The Declining Representativeness of British Politics and Why It Matters. Heinz, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
I suppose the key point in this is the system really actually not democratic?
I wouldn't go that far that it's not democratic. I mean, it's and a lot of people tend to argue that of course it makes it easier for governments to be formed, and you avoid situations like you have in many countries with very, very proportional systems that you need long coalition formation processes. And I mean, currently in the Netherlands, they're over half a year since the election and still haven't formed a government, and they have records of taking about a year or so to do it. So you don't have these problems. I mean, in the UK, I remember in 2010 with the coalition government, there was already upheaval because it took 4 days to form a government. So normally you have it within a day, and it makes easy to form governments and for governments, which most people also don't know. There's research which show that under first past the post, you have governments are fulfilling more of their pledges, their election manifesto pledges and promises than in coalition governments where it's more about compromising. So there's certainly advantages to it.
And I guess that's the point, isn't it? Because very often people say, well, having some form of proportional representation is a much fairer approach than having a first past the post system. But if you've got, say, 45% and 55% and you get some sort of coalition formed, or you've got two representatives there in Parliament who are almost equal in number, you're not actually going to get anything done, are you? They're just going to block each other for 5 years. It's just going to be completely ineffective government.
Well, it depends. It depends how coalitions work. And they can work better, and they can be more difficult. And I think we see fragmentation with people choosing various different political parties in all countries, just like you see in Britain. I just looked at the numbers this morning, and this is probably going to be the most fragmented vote that a British election has ever seen, where you have, you still have 40% party, but otherwise you have a number of 20 and 15% and 12% parties and so on. So a lot of people have different preferences, and that's first past the post is particularly bad at representing that.
Yeah, so I mean, we don't, of course, there'll be people listening to this podcast after the results are out, so we've got to be careful about making ourselves seem foolish by quoting statistics that might be completely disproven. But I'm looking at the electoral calculus, which shows they've been predicting how many seats people are going to get based on the number of votes. So they're predicting Labour's going to get 470 seats. That's 72% of the seats, with only 40% of the votes. So a massive majority for seats, but still a minority of votes. I mean, if it was proportional representation, they'd only get 260 seats. The Conservatives would have 130 seats. And here's the reform, which are predicted to only get 7 seats, would get 110 seats by that system. So I'm sure a lot of reform voters, if they get a poor showing in the number of seats, are going to be looking and saying, well, how is that fair? Because we have, claimed such a high proportion of the total number of votes.
Yes, and I mean, they've kind of experienced that before in 2015 when it was UKIP. And they basically didn't win any seats. They won the one seat that's from that defected Tory who was re-elected, but otherwise they didn't get anything for 13.8% of the vote. And I mean, Farage has been one of those who has been arguing for proportional representation, because he's always led parties that basically don't have a chance. I mean, the Lib Dems are much further. The Lib Dems actually will probably have their most proportional results ever, because they are much more concentrated in their vote and much more targeted. They benefit now from tactical voting. So they could actually get their best ever result in terms of seats on one of their worst ever results in terms of vote share.
Well, that in a sense is ridiculous, isn't it? I mean, going back to my first point about, is this really democratic? It is an argument for saying, if it's only circumstances that lend representation in the end, where your vote happens to be, whether it's concentrated or not. And I don't think in my entire history of voting I've ever actually been a constituency where I had political agreement with the person who's elected to represent me. So in a sense, my vote in all those elections has never counted. I mean, that can't be democratic, can it?
No, it's very problematic that usually also Britain is a country that has a lot of very, very safe seats, safe Labour seats, safe Conservative seats, where you have, they win 60, 70% of the vote, which is only broken when you have a massive landslide like now and a party collapsing like the Conservatives, and suddenly they could lose seats where they previously won 60% of the vote share. But in a normal election, that's a bit closer between Labour and the Conservatives. You basically have the majority of seats where there's no contest, and voters in these constituencies are not really participating in any other form than I don't know, sort of an expressive form. Okay, they register their vote preference, but it's pre-decided in their constituency who's going to win anyway.
So it's not really democratic, is it? I mean, that at the basic level, the people, individual people, are not able to express their views in a way that means anything.
And the problem with all of this is it's because it's based on relatively small constituencies, isn't it? Because the idea is you want your local representative in Westminster. So, but is that a bit old-fashioned? Just before you came on, Heinz, we were talking about one of the ideas which we didn't really explore, was the idea that maybe rather than smaller constituencies, we had a bit like Scotland, really, where you had a bit more of a proportional representation type approach for a larger region. So you have your electoral region and your constituency. So you still vote for constituency member, but you might have 5 or 6 members for a larger area, which might be the northwest of England, for example. So you get almost a mix of both systems. That seems like a more realistic way of representing the variety of views in a particular region, because the local area, I mean, we've got local councils, we've got local forms of government. Do we really need that localness to that degree represented in Westminster?
Well, for me, as a German who grew up in a federal system where you have different levels of government at state level and then also relatively strong local government, this whole idea that you need constituency representation at national level was always a bit alien to me. But clearly it matters. And I mean, that's why you have places like Scotland or as well New Zealand moving to a mixed system where you combine party representation with constituency representation. And actually, I think the system in New Zealand is better than the system in Scotland or Wales.
How does it work in New Zealand, just for information?
Well, basically in New Zealand, you have a total of 122 seats or so in Parliament. 71 of them are constituencies, just normal first past the post elections. And then there's another 51 seats which are list seats. And they have one nationwide list for all of New Zealand, which is the benefit compared to Scotland with the 8 regions.
So this would be lists by each party, and they would then get seats in proportion to that?
Yeah, you basically have 2 votes. So you have a constituency vote and you have a party vote. And basically the constituencies that a party wins are then being taken as part of their total allocation of seats, which is based on their party vote. And that works quite well. You can have some so-called overhang seats where a party wins more constituencies than it actually is entitled to seats overall. And I calculated that through yesterday or so for what it would mean for this election in the UK if you had that. Labour, given if they win something like 470 seats or so, even if you would say divide Britain in just 400 constituencies, so a bit larger than they are now, and then you would have 250 list seats, which would be just about the same system as in New Zealand, then Labour would win something between 50 and 80 overhang seats. So they would have more seats than would be their proportional share. So you would have a bit of a lopsided result, but not in a sense. But
you'd have a very strong government, wouldn't you? Because one party would dominate everything.
No, but Labour would not be able to win a majority of seats. They would win, say, if you had 400 seats, they would win something like 280 of the constituencies, but they wouldn't get any list seats in addition. So they would have 280 out of the 650 seats. They would be by far the largest party, but they would need a coalition partner. Only they could choose between either the Greens or the Lib Dems as their coalition partners, which would both make possible partners. Whereas if you had a perfectly proportional system, then Labour would most likely need 2 coalition partners. It could just about be enough with just one of them, depending on whether Labour actually get over 40%.
You can't have too many people in Parliament, obviously in New Zealand, because there's got to be other people left to do stuff in the country. But just over the water in Australia, they have a country I know well. The elections there are run on preferences. So in this country, translating for this country, for example, I might say, well, I want to vote for the Lib Dems. If the Lib Dems don't win, I want my vote to go to the Labour Party. And if I don't say anything, I just say I want to vote for the Lib Dems, the Lib Dems might decide themselves, if we lose a seat, we want our votes to go to the Labour Party. So you've got this system of preferences where it sort of filters down. Yeah. I mean, that seems to work fairly well. I'm wondering what it does mean theoretically that you could have someone who comes in third, for example, who then gets all the votes filtered through to them, and they actually come in first place, and the person who got the most votes. So it could be seen as a distortion, but there again, you are taking account of people's second and third choices.
Well,
and I don't know, is that a more fair system, do you think, Heinz?
Not really. I mean, the thing is, it would probably, if you applied that now from what we know about Lib Dem, Green, Labour voters or so, they would probably transfer preference between them, the 3 parties, which would mean that Labour would probably win under the alternative vote as many seats as they win in the Westminster election. So you could
possibly more, in fact.
Yeah. They could even win more. And the Conservatives, I mean, there was a referendum about this, of course, in 2011, and it was defeated also partly because the Lib Dems, who were the ones who wanted to have a referendum on something completely different, and weren't particularly into AV either. So nobody was in favor.
But in that system, you would see, for example, it would mean that you could vote for the Reform Party and say, and if they don't win, we want it to go to the Tories as our next choice. Or Tories might give preferences to Reform. It might help Nigel Farage.
Yeah, but these are still, they're in that sense, they're a majoritarian system, not a plurality system, because ultimately each candidate who gets elected has support from a majority. So a majority had them at least somewhere in their preference order. And that you have other systems like the French system with the 2-round system where people can vote for whoever they want to in the first round, and then the 2 or 3 top candidates go through into the second round. But all of them create the same amount of distortion in the end as first past the post does. So if you have one party dominating an election like Labour does now, they would, under all of these systems, get a vast majority, which I think is a problem AV would only allow people to express their preferences, but they don't get representation for that necessarily. The Greens would not necessarily win any more seats, even though they might have 13-14% of first preference votes. And that might even be more frustrating for people to see, well, this is actually what we wanted and we get nothing of it.
So Heinz, are you really saying that, with all its faults, perhaps, and I have to say a lot of people listening are saying, well, this is vastly complicated, whether it's AV or single transferable vote or topping up from party lists. This all seems very complicated, whereas a simple system is perhaps the best and easiest for people to understand, much like the one we have now.
But I think isn't the French system quite easy to understand in that you go, apart from the fact that
all of these are easy to understand, I think. The single transferable vote is one of the systems I quite like, because the Irish aren't a million times smarter than other electorates, and they don't have a problem using it, and Scottish people have adapted to it in local elections as well. It still divides the country into relatively not oversized constituencies, but each constituency has multiple representatives. So
explain how that. So the single transferable vote. If you get over a quota, you're in. But but then any subsequent candidates have got to get over that quota.
And it's where you put a 1, 2, 3, 4 or whatever on the
but that's like a preferences system then, isn't it?
It is a preferential system, and you can express you can just give a preference to your top candidate and nothing else, or you can have a list of 6 or 7 preferences in there, and they use it in
but you said to me that system, like in Australia, distorts democracy.
Yeah, but the system in Ireland, or used also in Northern Ireland, it produces relatively proportional results because they are not single-member constituencies. So you have the typical constituencies in Ireland has 4 or 5 members. So you get 4 or 5 representatives of parties elected. Sometimes that can be 2 from the same party, but more often than not, you have 3 or 4 different parties represented. So you can have a Conservative candidate, a Labour candidate, you could have a Green candidate and a Reform candidate, all from one constituency.
So if we had, I don't know, the northeast of England, for example, if we said, well, OK, let's pull Teesside and Newcastle together and let's give you 6 representatives in Westminster. So those 6, one gets over the quota they're in, and then the next ones, you basically take the next highest and the next highest, or people choose.
No, what you basically do is... So you look first at, is anybody already over the quota? If somebody has enough votes, which is sort of the number of seats plus 1, that's what you divide the total votes by. If anybody is over that quota, they get elected, and any of their votes over the quota that they had are then reallocated to other candidates. So you look at their second preferences. So if first a Labour candidate gets elected because he or she had over the quota, then you look at what was the second preference, and to those candidates, those votes go then. Then you look at who is the least, the one with the least votes, and they get eliminated, and their votes are reallocated. And then the next one who is the least with the least votes, and their votes get allocated until someone else gets over the quota. And that takes a number of counts when these different candidates are being eliminated or elected, and ultimately you then get your 5 or 6 candidates who get elected to parliament.
And this is in Ireland? This is the system used in Ireland?
This is the system used in Ireland. This is the system also used for Stormont elections in Northern Ireland, and the system used for local elections in Scotland.
And how long does it take to count the votes in Ireland? It sounds like the average journalist covering elections would have to have a degree in hypermathematics to try and understand it.
Not at all. I mean, the thing is that by now they have it all. It's basically electronic now.
Yeah.
Previously, when I lived in Ireland in 1990, that's where I did my PhD, and that was my first introduction to STV, which was a very strange system for me to get my head around. Back then, they actually had to physically count the votes, and then they took a random pot of the votes, whatever was left, and allocated them. Now they basically look at do it electronically. So when a candidate gets eliminated, or when a candidate gets elected, and they basically have so there's maybe 3,000 votes which need to be reallocated. They basically look at the overall second preferences for that all the voters of that candidate had, and proportionally the votes get then allocated to the second preferences.
Right. So, Roger,
I have to say, listening to this, Heinz, I suppose I can hear people saying, well, it does sound quite... I take on board you're saying it isn't complicated, it can be done, and a lot of people do it. But a lot of people might say, well, it's a simple system. Is there actually such a big democratic deficit from everything you've seen, Heinz, in the current system we have in the UK for Westminster elections that means it really needs to be reformed? Do you think there is an actual democratic deficit in that sense?
I think there's a deficit in the sense also that you have these parties like Labour and the Conservatives, which have to be these umbrellas. And we've seen over the past few years how dysfunctional the Conservatives were as a party. We've seen also with the Corbyn years and the fallout after, sort of Corbyn being kicked out of the party, how awkward partly an umbrella the Labour Party can be. And there only have to be these big umbrella parties because of the electoral system, because you have to be this big coalition that needs to win an election. And that doesn't mean that governing parties are more coherent than government coalitions in other systems necessarily.
But in Germany, for example, you have massive, the Social Democrats, the Christian Democrats, these big overall covering organisations, and you have a different electoral system there. Surely that's the same problem.
But are they less factional? Do they have less factions within them? I think that's what you're saying, isn't it, Heinz? That they don't need to. You could break up into different parties. They've been cut down to size, and so I would say that the parties internally are somewhat more coherent than their British equivalents. But by now they are 28-25% parties, and they are no longer these big catch-all parties that they were in the 1980s and 90s. Yeah. So Jeremy Corbyn might have formed his own party, for example. So Jeremy Corbyn could be a ticket alongside Keir Starmer
if we had a proportional system.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you might have the rather than the purge you saw through the Brexit years in the Conservative Party, they may have split into a more one nation Tory party and a more right-wing party or so, which would compete more directly with.
But that's what you have in Germany with the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, is being let into the system in a way that some people might say, well, isn't it better to have the system we have here, where effectively, maybe unjustly, but the political system doesn't have to have parties like Reform actually in Parliament?
Yeah, but doesn't that necessarily help? I mean, on the one hand, you have the danger of large parties being like you see in the US, what happened to the Republican Party with Donald Trump. They don't have small extremist parties, but they have one of the two main parties in their country being by any qualification pretty much a far right party by now. So you can have this entryism and sort of parties being taken over by have a quasi-hostile takeover of a political party. I don't think that. I mean, you also have these repeated successes for populist parties, being UKIP in 2015, the Brexit Party in the European election 2019, now the Reform Party, and they do have an impact, even though they may not win seats. But you wouldn't have had the whole Brexit referendum without the UKIP vote in 2015. So it's not necessarily that Britain is completely safe from populism. And you had a Tory party which became increasingly more populist under Boris Johnson then as a response to the Brexit vote.
Well, and there it was not because they thought that they were going to lose to another party, but they were worried that party was going to whittle away at their votes, which gives Labour a greater chance, which is hardly democracy, is it? The fact that, that's what we're seeing now, that the Tory party is getting its vote taken away from it because there are people voting Reform, even though Reform are not going to win those seats, and Labour wins as a result. So you've got people who are actually choosing two sides to the right of politics, allowing the left side of politics. I mean, that's electoral deficit, a democratic deficit, isn't it?
Yeah, this time it's going the other direction than it did in 2019, when the Brexit Party stood aside in half of constituencies, and that meant that the Conservatives could win a big majority, also on just 43% of the vote, because the actual majority vote, which was pro-Remain and to the left of the Conservatives, was split between two or three parties, and the Tories would win a lot of seats because of that. And now the rise of Reform actually has increased the disproportionality that this election will produce by quite a bit.
What sort of appetite do you think there is, Heinz, though, for change in our system? Because I mean, we saw, you mentioned the 2011 referendum, which was lost. Do you not think, for a start, the party that gets into power on the current system has no incentive to change the system, even though Labour voted at their last conference that they should, or in 2022 they voted that way? And do is there enough of a public demand, do you think, for any kind of change?
I think there could be enough demand, but you would need one of the big parties coming across to that. I mean, you have now the Conservatives complaining about this meaningless concept of a supermajority for Labour, but it does sound a bit like they are unhappy with the first past the post system when it doesn't benefit them.
Yeah, there's a certain irony in all that.
When you've just won, you don't want to change the system that's put you in. So look, there is a more complicated method. This apparently is the mathematician's favourite is the Condorcet method. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, Heinz.
Condorcet.
So this is where on the ballot paper you say for every party who you prefer, given the choice between two. So, for example, you'd say, do you prefer Tory over Labour? And now, okay, well, what about Tory versus the Lib Dems? What about Labour versus the Lib Dems? And you get asked all of those questions. This is what mathematicians like. So then you're basically saying, yes, well, I like Tory over Labour and Tory over the Lib Dems, but not over Reform. For example, I prefer Reform over Tory, so Reform would get
We have few enough people voting already.
But
Faced with
apparently
this, they wouldn't go near it.
love that because, that is the most mathematically
I'll see your Condorcet and I'll raise it with D'Hondt.
D'Hondt?
My favourite D'Hondt. You know all about D'Hondt, Heinz, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, the Condorcet thing is it's not an electoral system that anyone is proposing. It's just that's how you can sort of make a case that, well, any individual may have transitive preferences. So if I prefer Labour over the Conservatives and Labour and Conservatives and so on, you don't have circular preference. But societies do have circular preferences, which basically is one way of mathematically proving that no election result under any electoral system, in many cases, is actually creating an equilibrium. So it's not a meaningful result that would stay the same under every electoral system or so. The D'Hondt system is basically one of the way. I mean, it's just in proportional systems where you have to allocate seats. You need to find a way how to allocate them and how to get these quotas according to which seats are allocated to different parties. And some are more proportional and some are less proportional. But they are basically a technical feature of an electoral system which which is not, I mean, once you start trying to explain to the general public how these formulas work, you really turn them off any idea of electoral reform because it becomes too technical. It should
and it sounds complicated.
I mean, there should simply be, if you had a simple question to people, do you like what the UK system is doing, which is basically emphasizing through an election the selection of a government over parliamentary representation? Because in terms of parliamentary representation, a large number of people get overlooked by the system. But the system is relatively good at creating governments and simple governments and make it easy for them to form and to do what they want.
But it does sound like that the best system is, as you're talking about, like we see in Stormont, this idea that you have a region where you have a number of votes and it's proportional representation almost, isn't it, within that area. And so the US electoral system is an interesting one, isn't it? Because that's almost like, well, you've got those areas defined because they're the states. But that's, I mean, if they were smart, they'd be saying, well, let's do that on a proportional representation basis. But
that's never going to happen.
No, but the US system,
you win a state, you win the state.
The US system is even worse than here. I mean, it's the same system. You also have first past the post. For parliamentary elections or so at the state legislature or the House of Representatives or so, but it's worse because they have a lot of gerrymandering, which is sort of setting constituency boundaries in a way that benefits one party over the other. You also have a lot of collusion between parties, which means that on average, 90% of all senators and representatives get re-elected each election. I mean, there's all safe seats. You also have in many state elections uncontested seats. So the Republicans give up on certain seats in California because they can never win one. So they don't even put up a candidate, and vice versa in other states. So there's even less involvement and less representation and less democracy.
So Heinz, what you're saying is there is really no particular, I mean, there are systems and they are better or worse perhaps, but nothing, I think what you said really represents perhaps what an electorate would want to be, or not in a perfect way.
No, nothing can be perfect. I would just think that there are certain things that British voters do value. So you can't completely do away with constituency representation, I think. Whether that means like the solution to that can either be the New Zealand solution, which has been a success in New Zealand, and they had a later referendum confirming that they like this electoral system. Voters use their two votes. It's basically the same system as in Germany. Only my experience in Germany and looking at German data is Germans don't make any use of that because Germans have no sense of constituency representation, whereas New Zealanders vote very differently for constituency candidates than they vote for parties. And they're quite happy about it. And you have both the best of both worlds in a way that you do have constituency representation, but you also have very proportional outcomes and representation in parliament. The alternative, the other way would be something like the single transferable vote in Stormont or in Ireland, where you would have larger constituencies and everyone would not just have to be represented by the winner of the constituency, which for the majority is very often not someone they voted for, but you have 4 or 5 representatives of different parties. So everyone in the constituency or the vast majority of people in these larger constituencies would get a representative.
So I like that one. One of those
representation in
it is, yeah. And actually, do you know, one of the benefits of that as well, because I think one of the problems we've got in the UK is that obviously so much is concentrated in London and the southeast, and people are living up north or in the West Country or other parts of the country are sort of like almost a whim of what, Westminster decides. If you were to say we had that approach and you had, I don't know, a few big parties, a few big areas in the north of England, for example.
You're very keen on this.
You might see the rise of like a northern powerhouse party or whatever. All of a sudden.
The Northern League, like in Italy.
Okay. Who might get in, maybe slightly politically different, but they get enough to say, well, okay, this is what we promised for the north of England, and they get representation in Westminster, and we start to shift that balance a little bit.
Well, Heinz, we've got to draw this pretty close to an end now, but what would you, if someone came to you and said, now, what do you think would best fit Britain? for Westminster in terms of a change from the current system, what would you say?
I would probably say the New Zealand system. But the single transferable vote is more difficult to sell. On the other hand, I would basically say you would need to have a referendum, and not on a particular electoral system, but on whether people want to stick with first past the post, or whether they want to switch to a more or fully proportional system. And then it should basically be down. I mean, why would you want to necessarily confront people with what exact particular electoral system they should prefer? Because some are more difficult to understand than others. Although for New Zealanders, they had a referendum and it worked. They decided we do want to retain constituencies, but we want a proportional parliament, and they accepted that. And I don't necessarily think that British people would be opposed to that.
Based on 2011, they didn't.
So New Zealand had a great examples of that worked for them, but they had another vote, another referendum, which didn't work for them. It was a big deficit, a democratic deficit, in that people were fanatical about getting the Union Jack off the New Zealand flag. And so they had a two-stage process, and the first stage was, well, we've got to choose the flag first. And so people went and voted. So they had 5, so they got a whole bunch mocked up, and then a committee chose 2 or 3, I think. And people voted on the 2 or 3 in the first election to arrive at what the flag would be. Then people went to vote saying, well, what do you think? Should we change to this flag, or should we stay with the Union Jack? And of course, most people said, no, I don't like this flag.
So they stayed with the old one.
They would stick with the Union Jack, even though most people wanted to change the flag.
It sounds a bit like Eurovision voting to me, I think, where you have a jury and then you have the popular vote. That's the system I think I'd go for.
I mean, there's no perfect
system.
That's
the problem with referendums is always what kind of question is being asked and how it is asked, and that's quite problematic. But the main thing for electoral reform would be that you would need one of the major parties come behind it. And that's, of course, the problem now with Labour. They have no incentive to do so, even though a lot of their party members are actually in favour of proportional representation. And in general, I think if you look across party members of all the different British parties, you would find a strong majority for proportional representation, because party members are also very engaged in politics, and many of them are in parties and suffering under the system. And it's party leaderships who are problematic, I think, because they see the benefits for them of winning.
Don't vote for Christmas.
It is all in the wording, isn't it? When you come to it. So, for example, that question, what do you think about the idea of leaving all those leeches and bureaucrats in the European Parliament? Maybe that could have been worded better. Just before we go, hey, I don't know if either of you have watched. It's a very old movie, a Peter Cook movie from the 1970s called The Rise and Rise of Michael Rimmer. Have you seen that one, Heinz?
It's ages ago.
Ages ago, absolutely.
Phil is very old.
But he was he basically allowed people to vote on absolutely everything. And he promised that people would vote that have more say in government. Everyone voted for him on that basis. And so he just flooded people with choices for every single decision that had to be made. And in the end, people were so sick of it, he got on TV and said, well, this will be your last vote. You vote as to whether we ever have a vote again. And he basically
became a dictator.
There we are. Maybe that's the best system.
One suggestion I could make is what they introduced 5, 6, 7 years ago in India, is you have a none of the above option on the ballot paper.
They would definitely win.
And you get in each election millions of people choosing that.
Exactly. All you need to do is stand as the non-above party.
In the biggest democracy in the world.
Very good, Heinz. Good to talk.
Thanks so much, Heinz.
Excellent. Thank you. Bye.
I know we've talked about Australia a little bit.
Do we want about
a little bit? Democratic deficit of 1975 when John Kerr, the Governor-General, basically sacked the government.
Yes.
So, I mean, what a shame. King
Australian
Charles,
history on this podcast.
Very important. What a shame King Charles didn't have the gumption to say, well, I'm going to sack the Tory party, and because they're not doing a very good job.
Yes.
And, and we could have... when is too long? That's it's another question. We could have talked all day about this. How long should a term of Parliament be? Is 5 years long enough?
Yes. Well,
if we had a good system, maybe we'd stick with 10, but then you wouldn't want Rishi there for another 5 years, would you?
Well, how many elections do we want to get? Oh, God, not another election, famously.
That lady from Bristol.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, we don't want that.
All right, now we are are done with politics now.
Yes,
we've had a few weeks of it. I think we're all going
on holiday.
We all need a holiday.
Yes.
Yeah. But where are we going to go, and are we going to upset the locale?
Will we be welcome? Because it has to be said, there's quite a push now back against tourism. Yes, in the Canaries, there are people protesting against tourism, taking too much of the resources, causing problems for them there.
So they have to go back to their main business, which is...
What?
Hang on.
That's the problem. That's the problem. But I mean, in places like Venice, they're trying to stop people going there in as many numbers, of course. There's quite a pushback, generally, against the ways in which tourism does dominate certain parts of the world. In Japan, they actually put up a screen to stop people taking pictures of Mount Fuji, for example, from a certain place, because they found it was causing them problems. So I think what we should look at is how we cope with tourism. I mean, do we cope with tourism? Are we a major problem for some parts of the world? Or in fact bringing them lots and lots of money and income and basically supporting their economy?
And there's the whole second home thing as well.
Which is another issue,
There's sort of like Airbnb homes.
So there we are. Having made you feel guilty about politics, we're now going to make you feel guilty about your holidays as well.
That's right. You're not going anywhere. Stay at home and do with whoever you've just elected. All right, that's next week. Thanks for listening in today. It's been a fun one. That's the Y Curve. We'll see you next week.
The Y Curve.